Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Chapter 1, Story of the Door. Mr. Utterson was a lawyer. He was also a man of few words. On Sundays, he often went for a walk. Usually, he went with his friend, Mr. Enfield. One Sunday, they were walking down a small street. All the buildings were very neat and clean, except for one. This building was very dirty. It had no windows on the first floor. There was an old, unpainted door and one small window high up. As the two men walked by it, Mr. Enfield said, "That door reminds me of a very strange story." "Really? What story?" asked Mr. Utterson. "Well, it was like this. It was a black, winter morning, very, very early. I was walking home on a street near here. Suddenly, I saw two people. One was a little girl, about 8 or 9 years old. She was running as fast as she could. The other was a short man, walking along very quickly. They were coming down different streets. At the corner, they ran into each other. The man didn't even stop. He knocked the little girl down on the ground and kept walking. She was screaming, but he didn't stop. It was horrible. I ran after him. He was the ugliest man I had ever seen. His eyes were full of hatred, but he went with me back to the little girl. The girl's family heard her crying and came out. Someone went for a doctor. The doctor said the girl was all right. She was just very frightened. We were all very frightened. It was because of the short, ugly man. There was something terribly evil about him. We all hated him immediately. It was very, very strange. The doctor and I demanded that he give the girl's family some money for what he had done. Finally, he agreed to. We came here with him. He went to that door and went in. A few minutes later, he came out with a check. It had another man's name on it, a very famous and good man's name. We couldn't believe the check was real, so we stayed with the man until morning. Then we went to the bank together. The check was good. Said Mr. Utterson. "Now, every time I see this door," continued Mr. Enfield, "I think of blackmail. Dr. Jekyll, the writer of the check, is a very good man. He has an excellent reputation, but he must have done something terrible once, and now this Hyde is blackmailing him. At least, that's the only way I can explain it." "That is a very strange story," said Mr. Utterson, slowly. "What did you say their names were?" "Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde." Chapter 2. Search for Mr. Hyde. That night, Mr. Utterson came home deep in thought. He was thinking of a story. He ate his dinner very slowly. Afterward, he went to his office. There, he opened his safe and took out an envelope. Written on the envelope was Dr. Jekyll's will. Mr. Utterson was Dr. Jekyll's lawyer. He had had this will for a long time. He didn't like it. It worried him. In it, Dr. Jekyll wrote that if he died, everything should be given to his friend, Edward Hyde. Since Dr. Jekyll was a very rich man, Everything was quite a lot. But this was not all. Something else very strange was also in the will. It was something Mr. Utterson couldn't understand, but it made him worry terribly. At the end of the will, Dr. Jekyll wrote, "Mr. Hyde should get everything if I disappear for more than 3 months." Mr. Utterson and Dr. Jekyll were very good friends. They had known each other for nearly 20 years. Yet, Mr. Utterson had never met Mr. Hyde. This had worried him for a long time. But now that he had finally heard something about Hyde, he was even more worried. There was one other person who knew Dr. Jekyll very well. He was another doctor, the great Dr. Lannon. He and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Utterson had all gone to school together. The two doctors, however, had disagreed about something. It was only some sort of scientific disagreement. Jekyll was doing some experiments Dr. Lannon didn't like. But anyway, they would hardly speak to each other now. Mr. Utterson decided to go to Dr. Lannon's house. They talked for a while. Then Utterson asked the question he had come to ask. "Did you ever meet a friend of Dr. Jekyll's named Hyde?" "Hyde?" repeated Dr. Lannon. "No, never heard of him." This was the answer Utterson had expected. He still didn't like hearing it, though. He went home and tried to sleep, but he couldn't. He kept thinking of Hyde. He kept trying to imagine his face. It was a face that had made Enfield hate and fear the man. What kind of face can it be? He asked himself. Mr. Utterson thought about Mr. Hyde all night. Then, in the morning, he went to the door in the small, neat street. There he waited for Mr. Hyde. Day after day, for almost 2 weeks, he went there whenever he could. Finally, early one night, his waiting ended. A short man came to the door and started to open it. "Mr. Hyde?" asked Mr. Utterson. The man answered coldly, "That is my name. What do you want?" "I am an old friend of Dr. Jekyll's, Mr. Utterson, and—" "How did you know who I was?" asked Mr. Hyde angrily. "A friend of ours described you." "A friend of ours? Who? Dr. Jekyll never did. You're a liar." With that, Dr. Hyde went in the door and slammed it. The lawyer stood there afterward, looking at the door. He was very disturbed. Mr. Hyde was short and ugly. He had an angry voice and a strange look in his eyes. But there was something more. He seemed hardly human. "Oh, Dr. Jekyll, my dear friend, what have you done?" thought Mr. Utterson to himself. "This new friend of yours seems like Satan himself." Mr. Utterson then walked around the corner. Nearby was the front door of Dr. Jekyll's house. The butler answered Mr. Utterson's knock. "Is Dr. Jekyll home, Poole?" asked the lawyer. "No, I'm sorry, Mr. Utterson. He's gone out," answered Poole. "But I saw Mr. Hyde go in by the old laboratory door," said Mr. Utterson. "Isn't that strange if Dr. Jekyll isn't here?" "No, sir," replied the butler. "Mr. Hyde has a key." "He doesn't live here, does he?" "Oh, no, sir. He has a flat in Soho." "Dr. Jekyll seems to trust that young man very much, doesn't he, Poole?" "Yes, sir, he does," said the butler. "We all have orders to obey him. but we hardly ever see him, sir. Mostly, he comes and goes by the laboratory door." "I see. Well, good night, Poole. Good night, Mr. Utterson." The lawyer started for home with a heavy heart. "Poor Harry Jekyll," he thought. "I knew you were wild in your younger days. I wonder what you did to get in so much trouble. Oh, I wish I could help you, dear friend." Mr. Utterson, like Mr. Enfield, believed Dr. Jekyll was being blackmailed by Mr. Hyde. It was the only explanation he could think of. As he walked slowly along, however, a happy thought struck him. At least, there was some hope in it. This Mr. Hyde must have secrets of his own. They must be much worse than anything Dr. Jekyll could have done. I will find them out, Harry. By God, I will. Chapter 3. Dr. Jekyll's Will. 2 weeks later, Dr. Jekyll gave a dinner party. Mr. Utterson stayed after all the other guests had left. This was not unusual. He was almost always the last to leave. "I've been wanting to talk to you, Jekyll," he started. "It's about your will." A dark shadow crossed Dr. Jekyll's face, but he smiled immediately and said with a laugh, "My poor Utterson, you are so worried about my will. You're like Lannon, who's always complaining about my experiments." Mr. Utterson paid no attention to this new subject. "I don't like it," he continued. "My will? Oh, I know that. You told me before. And now I'm telling you again. Moreover," said Mr. Utterson, "I've been learning about this Hyde." Dr. Jekyll turned very pale. "I really don't want to talk about this." "But what I've heard is terrible," said Mr. Utterson. "It doesn't matter. You don't understand. You just don't understand." "Jekyll," said Mr. Utterson, "trust me. Tell me what's wrong. I want to help you." "My good Utterson," said the doctor, more calmly now, "you are very kind, but really there is nothing for you to do. Everything is fine. Don't worry. I will tell you one thing. Whenever I choose, I can be rid of Mr. Hyde. Now let's not talk of this any more." Chapter 4. The Carew Murder Case. Nearly a year later, a shocking murder occurred. There were only few details, but they were startling. A young woman worked as a maid nearby. She saw the whole thing from an upstairs window. It happened about 10 o'clock at night. A well-dressed gentleman was walking down the street. He was an older man and had beautiful white hair. Coming the other way, on the same street, was another man. He was much smaller and walked with a cane. The gentleman greeted the shorter man. Then he pointed down the street and seemed to ask directions. The other man turned then, and the maid could see his face. She was very surprised. It was Mr. Hyde. He had recently visited her master. That's how she knew him. As she watched, Mr. Hyde suddenly became very angry. He started yelling. Then, as the maid described it, he began acting like a madman. The next moment, he was hitting the gentleman over and over again with the cane. The older man fell to the ground, but Mr. Hyde kept hitting him and kicking him. It was so horrible that the poor girl fainted. It was 2 o'clock before the maid woke up. She called the police immediately. Mr. Hyde was gone, of course. But the old gentleman still lay in the street. He was dead. The dead man was Sir Danvers Carew. He was a member of Parliament. In his pocket he had a letter. It was addressed to Mr. Utterson. The police took the letter to Mr. Utterson and told him the maid's story. The lawyer turned completely white when he heard Mr. Hyde's name. "Oh, my God," he said. Months before, Mr. Utterson had gotten Hyde's address from Dr. Jekyll's butler, Poole. He had never gone there, but he went with the police now. The flat was expensively furnished. A cupboard was filled with good wine, and the dishes were of the best china. The rooms were a mess, however. Someone had obviously looked through the drawers in a hurry. Clothes lay on the floor in a pile, many with their pockets inside out. In the fireplace was the burnt end of a cane. Mr. Utterson recognized it. Many years before, he had given it to Dr. Jekyll as a gift. Hyde, of course, was gone. The landlady of the flat knew very little about him. She hadn't seen him for 2 months before the night of the murder. He wasn't a friendly man, she said. I always thought there was something wrong with him. Late that afternoon, Mr. Utterson went to Dr. Jekyll's house. The doctor was at the back, in the laboratory. There were bottles of chemicals on the tables, boiling beakers, and strange smells in the air. Dr. Jekyll looked deathly sick. He did not stand up to meet his visitor. His hand was weak and cold, and his voice was changed. "Have you heard the news?" asked Mr. Utterson. The doctor shuddered. Then he nodded slowly. "Everybody is talking about it." His voice was quiet and terribly sad. "You're not hiding this madman, are you?" "Utterson, I swear to God," cried the doctor. "I swear to God I will never have anything to do with him again. It is over. He is gone forever. I have had a lesson. Utterson, what a lesson I have had." And he covered his face for a moment with his hands. "Oh, for your sake," said Mr. Utterson with deep emotion, "I hope you are right." Chapter 5. Dr. Lannon. Time ran on. A large reward was offered for Hyde's arrest. He seemed, however, to have disappeared completely. Many stories came out about his past cruelty and violence, but no one had any idea where he was now. Dr. Jekyll's life changed dramatically. For nearly a year before Sir Carew's murder, he had been very withdrawn. Few people had seen him. Now, came out of his isolation. He began seeing his friends more often and having dinner parties again. He also became very generous to charities. At the same time, he seemed to find a new sense of religious feeling. This continued for about 2 months after the murder. Mr. Utterson was very happy to see his friend so much better. On the 8th of January, Mr. Utterson went to Dr. Jekyll's house for dinner. Dr. Lannon was there too. It was like the old days, when the three friends were always together. On the 12th, Mr. Utterson went to Dr. Jekyll's house again. He was told, however, that the doctor was not feeling well. He did not want to see anyone. The same thing happened on the 14th and again on the 15th. Mr. Utterson then went to see Dr. Lannon. Then, at least, he was welcomed into the house. Dr. Lannon, however, looked terrible. "What's wrong?" asked the lawyer. "I've had a terrible shock. I'm dying." The doctor spoke so seriously and with such emotion that Mr. Utterson believed him. Something awful had happened. "Jekyll is ill too," said Utterson. "Have you seen him?" "Don't speak to me about Dr. Jekyll," Lannon said in a loud voice. "I never want to hear his name again." Utterson did not know what to say. He tried to find out what had happened, but Dr. Lannon wouldn't talk about it. He just said, "Someday, after I'm dead, perhaps you will find out. But I cannot tell you now." That night, after he got home, Utterson wrote Dr. Jekyll a letter. He wanted very much to find out what had happened between his two friends. He also asked Dr. Jekyll why he wouldn't see him. Dr. Jekyll's answer came the next morning. It was a long, sad letter. There was nothing good in it. "I am sorry to tell you," wrote Jekyll. "I must be alone now. I am being punished for something I cannot tell you about. Oh, and I'm suffering so. There is only one thing for you to do. Just leave me alone. It is all I ask of you." Utterson was amazed. What could be wrong? Hyde was gone, and for 2 months Dr. Jekyll had been fine. Now, all of a sudden, everything had turned bad again. The following week, Dr. Lannon died. The night after the funeral, Mr. Utterson received a letter. On the envelope, in Dr. Lannon's handwriting, were the words, "Private," for the eyes of J. G. Utterson own alone. If he dies, destroy this letter without reading it. Mr. Utterson was almost afraid to open it. Inside was another envelope. It was also sealed. On it was written, "Do not open until the death or disappearance of Dr. Henry Jekyll." The lawyer could not believe his eyes. But, yes, there was the word disappearance again. It was just like in Dr. Jekyll's crazy will. What could it mean? Mr. Utterson wanted very much to open the letter immediately, but Dr. Lannon was his friend. In addition, Mr. Utterson was a lawyer. His professional honor kept him from looking. He put the letter into his private safe and went to bed. He didn't sleep well that night. Indeed, he didn't sleep well for a long time after that. Chapter 6. Incident at the Window. Over the next few weeks, Utterson went to Dr. Jekyll's house nearly every day. But every time the same thing happened. The doctor wouldn't see him. "He stays in his laboratory all the time," explained Poole. "He even sleeps there now. He has become very silent and hardly eats. There seems to be something on his mind." One Sunday, a few weeks later, Utterson and Enfield were on their usual walk. They happened to go along the little street at the back of the laboratory. Dr. Jekyll suddenly appeared in the upstairs window. He looked terribly tired and sad. "Jekyll," cried the lawyer, "how are you?" "Utterson," answered the doctor. His voice was low and weak. "Not well, not well." "You stay inside too much," said Utterson. "You should walk with us." "Oh, I would love to, but no. No, it's impossible. I dare not. But it's so good to see you, Utterson. I should ask you to come up, but everything is such a mess." "Well then," said the lawyer gently, "perhaps we can just speak to you from here." "That is just what I was going to suggest," returned the doctor with a smile. But just then, suddenly, his face changed. A look of complete terror and despair came across it. In a second the window closed. The two men below had only seen the look for an instant, but they were frightened to death. "Oh, my God," said Utterson. Enfield said nothing. He couldn't speak. His face was pale, and there was a horror in his eyes. They stood there in silence for a long time afterward. Chapter 7. The Last Night. A few weeks after the incident at the window, Poole came to Mr. Utterson's house. It was early in the evening, after dinner. "Mr. Utterson," said the butler, "there is something terribly wrong." "What? What's happened?" "I'm so afraid, sir," continued Poole. His lips trembled as he spoke. "Afraid?" said the lawyer. "What are you afraid of?" "Won't you come with me, sir? Come see, please." Mr. Utterson's only answer was to immediately get his hat and coat. The two men walked quickly out the door. It was a wild, black night, and very, very cold. At Dr. Jekyll's house, they went straight to the laboratory at the back. Outside the door, Poole stopped and whispered to Utterson, "Now, sir, please listen carefully. And, if by any chance he asks you in, don't go." These last words filled the lawyer with fear. The butler went up to the door and knocked. "Mr. Utterson is here to see you, sir," said Poole in a loud voice. An angry voice answered from inside. "Tell him I cannot see anyone." "I see, sir," said the butler. Then he took Utterson back into the house. He was shaking all over. "Sir," he said, looking at Mr. Utterson in the eyes, "was that my master's voice?" "It did sound changed," answered the lawyer, looking very pale. "Changed? No, no," said Poole with great emotion. "I know my master's voice. Someone else is in there. He's been in there since 8 days ago. He murdered my master. I know it." "But this is too strange," said Utterson. "If somebody murdered Dr. Jekyll, why does he stay in that room? It doesn't make sense." "I don't know," answered Poole, "but he, or it, or whatever it is in there, keeps asking for some kind of medicine every day, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. There's a note outside the door asking me to go to this or that chemist. I get what he asks for. Then another note comes. It always says to take the drug back. It's not pure enough. I don't understand why, but whoever is in there really wants that medicine." "There's one thing else I haven't told you," continued Poole. "I haven't seen him." "Seen him?" repeated Utterson. "Well, I went out to see if there were any notes. He was putting out his dinner dishes. Suddenly, he saw me coming through the garden. He screamed and ran back inside. I didn't see his face, but he was a short man and—" "Hyde," said the lawyer. There was horror in his voice. "Yes, sir," said Poole. I pray to God that it's not true, but that's who I think it was, because I had this strange feeling when I saw him. You must know, sir. You've met him. I don't know how to describe it. He just makes you feel cold and afraid inside. Yes, I know what you mean, said Utterson. That's what I felt when I saw him. He was not my master. I know that. I think it was Hyde. And I think that he's murdered Dr. Jekyll. Well, said Utterson, both angry and afraid, we're going to find out, and I'm going to break down that door. I was hoping you would say that, sir, answered the butler. Then he picked up an axe from the garden. The two men went to the laboratory door. Utterson knocked and said, Jekyll, I demand to see you. He waited a moment, but there was no answer from inside. I'm warning you. I must, and will see you. Utterson, said the voice, please don't, have mercy. That's not Jekyll's voice. It's Hyde's, cried the lawyer. Break down the door, Poole. It took several minutes to cut through the door with the axe. Finally, they got it open, but it was too late. Inside, on the floor, lay the body of a man. It was Edward Hyde. Strangely, though, he was wearing Dr. Jekyll's clothes. They were much too big for him. In his hand was a small bottle of poison. He had killed himself. Poole and Utterson tried to find Dr. Jekyll. They looked in all the rooms of the laboratory. Then they looked in all the closets. They looked everywhere for him, but they couldn't find him. On one table, there were some chemicals boiling. That's the drug I was always bringing him, said Poole. On another table, there were a number of books. There was also a very large envelope with Mr. Utterson's name on it. Inside were several papers and another large envelope. One of the papers was a will. It was exactly like Dr. Jekyll's first will, except for one thing. Instead of Edward Hyde, it left everything to John Gabriel Utterson. Utterson was completely amazed. But why? He asked, looking at Poole. Why didn't Hyde destroy this? He could have had everything to himself. Also, in the large envelope was a note addressed to the lawyer. It was also in the doctor's handwriting. This has today's date on it. Jekyll may still be alive, said Utterson. He was quite excited. What does it say? Asked Poole. The lawyer began to read it aloud. Utterson, when you get this, I will have disappeared. How, I do not know, but something tells me the end will be soon. Anyway, go now and read Lannon's letter. He warned me that he would be writing you. After that, if you still want to hear more, read the following confession of your unfortunate and unhappy friend, Henry Jekyll. The confession was in the other envelope. It was well sealed. Utterson put it in his pocket. Then he hurried home to read Dr. Lannon's letter. Chapter 8. Dr. Lannon's Story. On January 9th, now 4 days ago, I received the following letter from Henry Jekyll. Dear Lannon, you are one of my oldest friends. I know that we have disagreed about scientific questions, but I hope we have never stopped being friends. I need your help. I need it desperately. Please don't say no. Stop everything else you are doing tonight and go to my house. Poole will be waiting for you. Go to my laboratory and open my cabinet. Take the fourth drawer from the top. Take the whole drawer, with everything in it exactly as it is. Next, take the drawer back to your house. At midnight, a man will come for the drawer. Please give it to him. Then, if you really want to know, he will explain to you why this is so important. I know you will think that this is crazy, but please do as I ask. My life depends on it. I will thank you forever. If you don't help, you will never see me again. Your friend, Henry Jekyll. After reading this letter, I was sure that Jekyll was insane. Still, I went immediately to his house and did as he requested. I was home with a drawer long before midnight. I couldn't understand why the drawer was so important. There was only a small bottle with some red liquid in it, a package of white powder, and a notebook. In the notebook, there was a list of dates. I guessed it had been something to do with an experiment Jekyll had been doing. At exactly midnight, there was a knock on the door. I answered it and found a small, ugly man standing there. His clothes were very expensive, but they were much too big for him. He gave me the strangest feeling. I disliked him immediately. "Do you have it?" he asked impatiently, as soon as he walked in. "Do you have it?" "Come, sir," I said. "Slow down. I don't even know who you are." "I beg your pardon, Dr. Lannon," he said. "I'm here for Dr. Henry Jekyll. It's very, very important. He said you would have a drawer." "It's over there," said I, pointing at my desk. The drawer lay on top of it, with a cloth over it. He ran over to it and pulled the cloth off. When he saw that everything was there, he gave a little cry. Then he quickly picked up the small bottle of red liquid and mixed some of the powder into it. The mixture started to smoke. Then it turned blue, then green, then finally a dark purple. "And now," he said, turning toward me with a strange smile, "shall I keep my secret, or do you insist on knowing? Think carefully." "I have come too far to stop now," I said. "Tell me everything." "All right, then," said my visitor. "But you are under an oath as a doctor not to tell anyone about this. Now I will show you something no other man has ever seen." He drank the liquid then. A cry came from his mouth. Then he fell to the floor. He was gasping for air. Slowly a change came in his face. It turned black, and then seemed to grow bigger, and then, "Oh God!" I screamed, and "Oh God!" again and again. There in front of my eyes, pale and very sick-looking, was Henry Jekyll. I cannot tell you everything he told me in the next hour, but it was horrible. What I saw and what I learned, I can hardly believe. The things that the man had done, they were awful. I will tell you one thing. That will be enough. You will understand then. The man who came to my house that night, by Jekyll's own confession, was the murderer of Sir Danvers Carew, Edward Hyde. Hasty Lannon. Chapter 9. Henry Jekyll's Letter. I was born into a very rich family. I had a happy childhood, and I always tried very hard to be good. Occasionally, as I grew older, I wasn't so good. I always kept these sins secret. Still, I was fascinated by my bad side. In college, I began to think about this very seriously. I decided that people are not really one, but two. We have two very different sides, a good side and a bad side. I often dreamed about dividing these two sides, The good side would be free of temptation. The bad side would be free of guilt. Each would be better off, I decided. At about this same time, I started experimenting with various drugs. I found a special powder. I mixed it in a certain way and boiled it. Then, with great courage, I drank it down. I felt sick immediately. It was horrible. A few minutes later, however, I felt better. Suddenly, I felt younger, more alive. I also felt free. My thoughts were filled with evil, but I didn't care. I liked it. I was very excited. I shouted and stretched out my hands to clap. It was then that I noticed that I was shorter. I wanted to see what I looked like. There was no mirror in my laboratory, so I decided to walk to my bedroom. It was very late at night, and everyone in the house was sleeping. Outside in the garden, I looked up at the stars. They had never seen anything like me before, I thought. I opened the door of the house quietly and walked in. I felt like a stranger in my own house. In my bedroom, I saw for the first time the face of Edward Hyde. I think I know why he is so small. Most of my life, I had been good. My bad side, therefore, was less developed. It had not been exercised or used so much. Perhaps this is why Hyde was younger, too. He certainly had more energy, but it may have been because he was pure evil. I was always amazed later how people always disliked him immediately. He gave people a bad feeling, even without saying anything. I looked at Edward Hyde in the mirror for only a few minutes. Then I rushed back to my laboratory. I wanted to see if I could return to my old self. I prepared the mixture again and drank it down. Once more, I had a terrible, sick feeling. But in a few minutes, I was myself again, with the face and body of Henry Jekyll. My life after this evening was very different. I became a slave to my drugs. Just think of it. Whenever I wished, I could change into Edward Hyde. Then I could do anything I wanted, anything. And no one would know it was me. I felt completely free and safe. Even if I did something terrible, I could always become the respected Dr. Jekyll. No one could find Hyde. I arranged everything. I got a flat in Soho. I told my servants to obey Mr. Hyde. After that, I was free to come and go in the house as either person. And I wrote that will. In case anything to happen to me as Dr. Jekyll, Hyde would still have my money. As Dr. Jekyll, I could remember the terrible things that Hyde did. I didn't feel very guilty, though. Somehow, he was a different person. It was Hyde, and Hyde alone, that was bad. I would wake up in the morning and be myself again. I had done nothing wrong. As Dr. Jekyll, I did try to undo some of the bad things that Hyde did. This seemed enough to ease my conscience. In any case, I didn't want to stop becoming Hyde. I was fascinated by his life. There was some danger, of course. The time Hyde ran down the little girl is one example. Your friend, Mr. Enfield, stopped me. I had to come here to get a check with Henry Jekyll's name on it. After that, I opened up an account in Hyde's name. I thought I was completely safe then. About 2 months before the murder of Sir Carew, I had my first real trouble. The night before, I had been on one of my adventures as Edward Hyde. I had returned, changed back into Jekyll, and gone to bed. When I woke up in the morning, however, I had a strange feeling. I didn't feel like myself. Suddenly, I looked down and saw my hands. They were the rough, hairy hands of Edward Hyde. I rushed to the mirror. What I saw frightened me to death. I had gone to bed as Henry Jekyll, but I had awakened, to my great horror, as Edward Hyde. I didn't know what to do. My drugs were in the laboratory. The servants were already awake, so I couldn't leave my bedroom. How could I get my drugs? How could I change back into Henry Jekyll? Then I remembered that the servants all knew Hyde. I got dressed and walked straight through the house. Poole saw me, but he was afraid of Hyde and said nothing. A few minutes later, I returned as Jekyll and had breakfast. I wasn't very hungry, though. I couldn't understand what had happened. I had noticed some changes recently. Hyde seemed to be growing bigger, and it seemed that I needed more and more of the drug to return to being myself. In the last few months, I had had to double the amount I took. One time, I had even had to take 3 times as much. At first, it had been difficult to become Hyde. Now, it was increasingly difficult to become Dr. Jekyll again. I was slowly losing my original balance. My better self was losing to my worse self. I knew then that I had to choose between the two. I would miss the evil pleasure, the woman, the drinking, the fighting, and the gambling, as well as the youth and energy I enjoyed as Hyde. But I chose to be Jekyll. It was not an easy decision. For some reason, I kept Hyde's flat in Soho, and I did not throw away his clothes. Still, for several months, I tried very hard to forget the excitement of the low life I had lived as Edward Hyde. These were good months. My life was very quiet, but it was also happy in a way. Slowly, however, I began to think more and more about Hyde. Finally, late one night, I couldn't stop myself. I took the drug again. Edward Hyde had been caged up inside of Henry Jekyll for too long. He came out filled with even more anger and hatred than before. It was that night he killed Sir Carew. There was no reason for it. Sir Carew did nothing wrong. Hyde just felt like killing him. He beat and beat the poor man over and over again. It was like hell had broken loose. The next day I felt terrible guilt, but I didn't want to die. Life was sweeter than ever to me. I wanted to live more than anything else. I knew that Hyde could never show his face again. This was a relief in a way. I had no choice now. I could never again be Hyde. For the next 2 months, I tried to be good. I did everything I could to help other people, and day by day, I felt happier with my new and quieter life. But all good things must end. In January, I went for a long walk in Regent's Park. After a while, I sat down on a bench in the sun. Suddenly, that old sick feeling came again. The next moment, my clothes were much too big for me. Once again, I was Edward Hyde. What could I do? My drugs were at home. But I couldn't go there. Hyde was a murderer, being hunted by the police. Finally, I decided to try to get Dr. Landon's help. You know that story by now, so I won't repeat it. Dr. Landon did what I had asked him, and I was saved again. But it was only for a short time. In the morning, I woke up at home, still myself. I was tired but grateful. I still had hope for the future. A moment later, however, I felt the sickness again. I ran to my cabinet and took my drugs. I took a double dose to keep Hyde away. Then, 6 hours later, it happened again. Since then, I've had to take the drug every few hours. If I fall asleep, I always awake as Hyde. Now, I'm even afraid to close my eyes. It's horrible. How Hyde hates me, and I him. I get sicker and sicker, but the sicker I get, the stronger he becomes. Oh, I suffer like no man has ever suffered. I don't know how long I could have continued, but there is no hope now. One last, terrible thing has happened to me. I have run out of the drug I need. I have sent Poole everywhere to get more. I've tried dozens of different kinds, but none of them works. There must have been something impure in the first one. There's no point in saying anything more. Things cannot go on for long. I'm using the last of the old drug to write this. It will soon wear off. I do not know how Hyde will die, but I know that for Henry Jekyll, this is the end. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the story.